Oh, okay. How are you? Yeah, I'm great. How are you? Thanks for coming. Wow. My benefactor. Oh, Lord, already. So is it just both of us here? No. So are you going to be here too? Oh, good. Everyone's here. All right. Excellent. This is different from yesterday. Why did we change? Oh, okay. So when I heard the calendar.
You shouldn't need to do anything. Just check to make sure your video camera is on.
Christian man, good afternoon.
Tony, your video camera on.
So he's where? At the airport. He's in Philly with his mom.
They do. So, okay. Well, I will start video. Of course, I've tried that on and off. The mute is working.
Your audio is
Is
good.
your video physically blocked? Your camera?
Okay, now we're getting you, Tony. Now we're getting you.
Twitter is relatively new, and it has a secret little camera, which, thanks to you, Christine, I have remembered where it is.
All right.
Now, can you see me?
Yes.
Well, I'm sorry about that, because it's
That's
not
right.
a pleasant sight.
So,
But you can hear me also?
yes.
Okay.
Tony,
Yeah.
slightly adjust your screen so we'll get a bigger picture of you. Your screen is adjusted. Or just, yeah, that's good. Now we get you. All right. Right, whoa, stop, right there, I see. Now we seem to be, our audio
Good
seems to be.
afternoon. This is Dr. Mritala Mansour.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon. Professor Christian Mark, good afternoon.
Good afternoon to all. Good morning. I'm in Montana, and so it's 5:45 a.m. So good morning, all of you.
Mansour Mritala from the University of
Nice
Ibadan.
to see.
It's my
I'm very,
pleasure.
very pleased to meet you.
My pleasure.
Nice to be here with all of you.
Yeah.
I'm just Deji and Abosede are the only two who aren't with us yet. Is that correct?
Well, that may be so, but I have, apart from you, Christine, and a view of the hall, I've only one picture of Monsuru, and he is absolutely
He's
fixed.
muted.
And that looks like a photo rather than a current video.
That's correct, Monsieur. We have a picture of you, not your live video. And for Vivian, at the moment, we have only a name. But we
Yeah,
did
this
have
is
her
me.
picture. Now there's Vivian. Hi, Vivian.
Hi, yes, I was part of
This
the
is
session
me.
yesterday where we were asked to just do our video because of bandwidth when we're speaking. But
Now, would you say that again? I haven't heard this piece of information. Please repeat that.
This was just, I was part of a session yesterday where we turned our cameras off unless we were speaking, just in case the internet, to reduce bandwidth.
All right, let's see if we need to do that, we will. Thank you for that piece of information.
Yes, the sound is not.
Sorry,
Yeah.
may I ask this question?
Who is this? Monsuru?
Mansuru, yes.
Monsuru,
Go ahead.
you are moving, Monsuru, but not totally.
Video,
We can't see you.
or you can put picture.
If you would, right now, your face is in the dark. I can see the room behind you, but not your face. And now that I can see your face better now, if you would prefer to have a picture on the screen and then for us to hear your voice, that's okay too.
Okay. I may go for the picture thing. Yes.
If you prefer that, that'll be all right.
Okay, fine. I'll switch to the picture.
All right, that's fine if that's what you'd prefer.
Yes.
Let's see. And we see the room. We're still waiting for Abosede and Ademide and
They
Deji.
might be there in person. They might be there in
I see-
person.
Deji, Ademide, Bosi, can you hear us or see us? Here's someone coming.
So, I know you have the remote control.
Yeah. Just a minute ago, I sent Demide's voice. Looks like
So, I mean, they can zoom in, they can do.
there they are. Okay.
Yes, facing out.
Deji, Abosede, and Bosi, can you hear us? They can hear us. I'm getting a thumbs up. All right, good. Okay. The time I think is now. I think we're just a moment or two over time. So I think we'll go ahead and start. If at some point you cannot hear me, know that. Tony?
Yes, for my elderly ears, you are just a little bit, I need a bit more volume if you can manage it. I've got my own volume turned up totally full.
I now do have mine turned up totally full. It should be a little bit better now.
It is a little.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
That's as far as my volume will go.
Yeah.
Well, we have to check it.
Okay, I'm going to open. All right. Hello, my name is Kristen Mann. I'm a professor emerita of history at Emory University. I'm pleased and honored to welcome you to session 1A of LSA 2024. Author meets readers, engaging capitalism in the colonies, African merchants in Lagos, 1851 to 1931, written by A.G. Hopkins and newly published by Princeton University Press. I'll chair this session, and I want first briefly to introduce you to the author and the 5 scholars who will comment on his new book. A.G. Hopkins, Emeritus Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at Cambridge University, truly needs no introduction. I doubt there's anyone in the audience who is unfamiliar with his seminal and economic history of West Africa, now in its 2nd edition. Many of you will also know his numerous pivotal essays on Lagos and Nigerian history. His prize-winning British Imperialism 1688 to 2015, co-authored with P.J. Kane, his edited collections of Empire. Those of us interested in Lagos history also know Professor Hopkins from his PhD dissertation, which we've read many times and often cited in our own work. In the interest of time, I'm going to allow myself 1 minute to introduce each of the 5. They are in the alphabetical order they appear in the program, and soon will speak. Ademide Adelushi Adeluyi, assistant professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. Her path-breaking book, Imagine Lagos, Mapping History, Place, and Politic Press, August 22. Abosede George, Tao, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies, Barnard College, is known for her excellent book, Making Modern Girls, A History of Girlhood, Labor, and Social Development in Colonial Lagos, winner of the Edu Snyder Prize 2015. Abosede is the creator of the Ecopolitan Project, a digital archive of family history sources on migrant communities in 19th and 20th century Lagos. The rich site continues to grow. Check it out if you haven't already. Vivian Liu is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Rice University. Vivian's work focuses on the culture and politics of markets and transnational commerce and diasporas, with an emphasis on the circuits of Igbo Nigerian businessmen across the Middle East and Asia. She recently has published articles in American Ethnologist and African Studies Review. Monsuru Muritala is a reader in the Department of History at the University of Ibadan. Before taking up his academic post, he had a career in banking. What a pleasure it is to have someone on the panel with real-world experience in business and finance. Monsuru has been Cadbury Fellow at the Center of West African Studies, the University of Birmingham, and a British Academy Visiting Fellow at Queen Mary University of London. He's the author of Livelihood in Colonial Lagos, and he's also a biographer. Ayodeji Olukoju is a distinguished professor at the University of Lagos, where he's also served as head of the history department and dean of the Faculty of Arts. He's a former vice chancellor of Caleb University and a fellow of the Nigerian Academy of Letters. Deji's research interests span maritime, transportation, economic, and urban history. He has held prestigious fellowships in Japan, Britain, Germany, and at my own institution. Deji is the author and editor of many books, including The Liverpool of West Africa, The Dynamics and Impact of Maritime Trade in Lagos, 1900 to 1950. Now, a word about the ground rules for today. I will very briefly introduce Professor Hopkins's new book. Then each of our commentators will have 10 minutes to talk about it. I will give each speaker an 8-minute warning. It looks a little bit fuzzy, but like that. So watch for that. I hold it up. And then I will call time at 10 minutes. I'll make those work. Professor Hopkins will reserve his comments for the end, and he'll have about 20 minutes to speak. We hope to have a few minutes at the end for questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, which you must keep short, type it in the chat and I will recognize as many people as possible before we close. Capitalism in the colonies, Professor Hopkins once again demonstrates his gifts for synthesis and for distilling key research questions that need to be addressed to move a field forward at a particular moment in time. In this book, his subject is the expansion of capitalism in Lagos, a major colonial port. He argues that African merchants, whom he theorizes as entrepreneurs, played a major role in the process implications for economic affairs, which the author calls shocks. First occurred in 1851 when Britain bombarded Lagos in the name of ending the external slave trade. The second in 1890. The third occurred in 1914 when World War I broke out. In each of these periods, some of the African merchants faltered, but others innovated and held on. African innovation is a major theme of the book. The analysis of each of these three periods is organized in the same way. First comes a chapter explaining the larger economic and political context. Next comes an overview of the merchant experience. Then comes case studies of two or more entrepreneurs who were important in the period. Professor Hopkins brings much rich new data to bear when analyzing all three of these periods. Although a work of economic history, the text also attends to cultural, political, and personal matters. The data have been garnered not only from colonial dispatches and reports, but also from land records, colonial court records, probate records, and perhaps most significantly, in certain cases, also from personal papers and interviews with descendants. Some of these sources no longer survive. Professor Hopkins' portraits of the merchants, all seminal figures in Nigerian history, people like Taiwo, J.P.L. Davies, I.B. Williams, and P.J.C. Thomas, to name only 4 of them, are unsurpassed. Finally, Professor Hopkins' prose are lucid and a pleasure to read. Excellent maps and well-chosen images further enrich the text. Now, for commentary, I turn to our panelists. Ademide, will you please begin?
So, well, you heard it at 10 minutes, so I'm going to get started as quickly as possible. Can you hear me in the back? Maybe, yes. No. So can they hear you on? Oh, can you hear me online as well? Oh my goodness.
Yes, we can hear you online.
Okay, I'm going to try to project as clearly and as quickly as possible. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. As Kristen Mann said, my name is Ademide Adelusi Adeluyi. I'm a historian of mid-19th century Lagos. So good afternoon, and thank you for coming to this panel where we're going to celebrate and engage with Professor Hopkins's newest work on the history of Lagos in the 19th and 20th century. So for me, it's such an honor and a privilege to be on this panel as one of the most junior scholars sandwiched between incredible people and people online. It's, you know, one never imagines that one will end up on this kind of panel discussing and reading and talking to people whose work has guided your own since you started your own research. But I will continue to go quickly. So like many other scholars of Lagos and Nigeria, I have benefited immensely from Professor Hopkins's work on Lagos, especially for me from his earliest work on property rights and annexation, his work on economic history, and now to this exciting and quite enormous book on the history of entrepreneurs in Lagos. You can't see it, I haven't seen it yet, but it's almost 600 pages. So I imagine it's extremely thick. And really, it's actually really well researched, really well written, and it's been a pleasure to get through this material. And I look forward to having a physical, real copy. Now, since Professor Mann has already introduced the book, I'm not going to get into the details of all of that, but I'm going to get into what I'm most interested in, at least my engagement with his text. So as I said earlier, I'm a historian of mid-19th century Lagos, mostly from the 1840s to around the 1870s, which is a period that very few people tend to write about, except, of course, Professor Mann and Professor Hopkins. So for me, I'm an urban and spatial historian. I'm really interested in how Lagos was built, how it was destroyed, how people inhabited space, where they lived, why they lived, how they lived and how they died, and the traces that they left of themselves in the city. So these are things we don't often hear about. We often hear a lot about obas and land and a lot of political stuff. But what I'm really interested in is actually the nitty-gritty. How can we, well, I was gonna say imagine Lagos, but anyway, that's the title of my book. But how can we really understand the kind of place Lagos was? Because as anyone who's been here understands, Lagos is a real place. You can feel it when you're here, and I think that's important. So for me, this book at first made me think of a, I guess, quite well-known quote from J.B. Wood, who writes in his 1881 text that, quote, "The real Lagosian loves above everything else to be a trader." So this is from his book in 1881. So even though so many of the entrepreneurs that Professor Hopkins features in his book have roots in Sierra Leone and other parts of the coast, all over the West African coast and outside, one of the things that Hopkins demonstrates is how they actually became Lagosians starting in the 1850s. Through trade, through acquiring wealth, property, and of course, debt, which is inescapable in Lagos of this time period. Professor Hopkins offers a long view on old Lagos, not only because of his own experience of doing this work since the 1960s, but also in writing the history of a city that actually contributes a finely textured detail to Lagos and Lagosians, taking us from the bombardment in 1851 through annexation in 1861, the high imperialism of the 1890s, and the turn of the century into the First World War. So what I'm going to do, oh, I forgot to start my timer. So I'll tell myself I have 7 minutes left. So, so what I'm going to do with the rest of my time is talk about the sources, and I've decided to pick the shock in the book. So the book is arranged around 3 shocks. So I'm going to pick the shock that I'm most interested in. So his book is organized into 3 shocks that span from 1851 to 1931. The first shock is the shock of the consequences of the violence of the British bombardments of Lagos. And this places one of the ships who actually worked aboard one of the ships that was involved in the bombardment of Lagos. So it's such an exciting and interesting take on this. The second shock looks at the effects of high imperialism and the impacts of the invasion of the interior of Yoruba land. Of course, the increasing racial discrimination that we see in Lagos during the period of high imperialism in the 1890s. And in this section, he reflects on the fortunes of the Blazes, the Dorothys, and the Cokers, really important merchant families that emerge in Lagos. The third shock engages with another war, which is the Great War, World War I, and explores the resulting decline in economic fortunes in Lagos. So for me, who is particularly interested in the bombardment of Lagos, I'm going to focus on the first shock and the impacts on Lagos and the growth of the merchant community, and of course, the shape of the city from 1851. Hopkins relies on a variety of sources, from newspapers to do this work, from newspapers to maps, and a variety of things, as Professor Mann said, also private papers that exist with different families. But to me, there are two really important sources that he uses: the records of land transactions from the Lagos Land Office and the court cases where people manage disputes in their families over marriage, death, and inheritance and other things. In reading and interpreting these sources, he builds a really rich and complex history of the city, plot by plot, sometimes house by house, business by business. We're able to track people's fortunes, the arc of their fortunes, wealth, and even decline in some cases through what they bought, what they lost, what they sold, who they traded with, where they came from. So the book is a really finely detailed portrait of how transactions shape cities and shapes people's relationships in the city as well. But at the same time, his work also highlights the tragic loss of access to these sources. As he notes in the books, only him and perhaps Kristen Mann have really had access, not just to the land registry records, which we know are now mostly lost, but also to the court cases and others. So while highlighting the tragedy of these losses to the rest of us, it's fortunate for us that the way he writes is almost archival in this sense, almost like an encyclopedia. So when you do get to read the book, you'll see that it's very richly detailed, and you can almost walk through these land cases with him. So even though we may not have access to the originals, we do have access because of the way he's generously written and shared the material. And of course, beautifully, because of his press, the footnotes are at the bottom of the page. So you don't have the hassle of turning to the end. But so in a way, it also reminds me of the impact of Pierre Verger's book on trade relations in that, and how that text is not only just interesting, but also functions as a kind of encyclopedia for those of us who may not have access to things that are gone. So from my perspective, who's interested in how Lagos is built and the spatial history of the city, his interpretation of mortgages, which he defines as not the kind of mortgages we may expect now, his interpretation of mortgages, death, agriculture, all of this allows us to see how capitalism and entrepreneurship shape the city of Lagos. And because of this, we can populate the marina and important parts of Lagos, a little bit about Isaleko, a lot about Olobo, but he writes a lot about the men of the marina. We can walk with him along the city as their fortunes wax and wane from the mid-19th century to 1931. So our keynote speaker this morning, I was thinking about what she said. Ooh. Kristen, I'm sorry, I don't know if I got my warning. Yes. No, okay. No. So our keynote speaker today said that, quote, place is relative, physical, or local, inter, or transnational. Many books about Lagos and other cities in Africa will leave too much to the imagination. It's very hard to get a sense of, we get a sense of who the action is about, but not where it's happening and where it's unfolding. When you read this book, because it's transnational and transregional, it also links urban, rural, and all kinds of spaces in between, agricultural, urban spaces. This book is a book that's firmly rooted in space, which is probably why I'm on this panel in that sense. We can be in Lagos with them. We can be with these families. We can be with them as they gain their wealth, as they have these transactions, everything that's happening. So you may think it's pitched as an economic history, but really it's a kind of social history of people. These fortunes and the loss of these fortunes are actually tied to people. They're tied to families. They're tied to people who endure and try to make a world for themselves in Lagos, as difficult as it could be there. So for me, we can move east, we can move with Lagos as it expands from west to the east, to the streets of Olobo and down the marina, as we walk with him as he writes about the men of the marina in the 19th and 20th century. I'm going to conclude my remark with two questions. Okay, that's my warning, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with 2 or 3 questions. Maybe I'll do 2. So of course, the big question here is that we're looking at male merchants. There are many, 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 many of them. Many of them are interesting, important, and exciting. And you note yourself, Professor Hopkins, on page 85, that women are outside of this record, right? And we're not surprised that women are not as abundant in the archival record. But at the same time, this is Lagos, this is Yoruba land. We know that women are economic actors. We know that women, even though Victorian ideals may take over later, and this idea of what it means to be ladylike may affect people, women are important economic actors in this space. So how should we read around their absences? How can we read around them? How can we read between these absences so that we can continue to engage with Lagosians more fully, right? Who are the women who are part of this? And how can we think about thinking more clearly about gender and women in this kind of work that we do in Lagos? Because it's hard to think about entrepreneurship and markets and not think about women, whoever they are in this city. So how should we do this as the ones coming after you? And then my second question was about the Saro story, but time saw stop. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ademide, and you did a great job keeping on time. Abosede, would you please begin?
Okay. Professor Hopkins, can you hear? Because I'm not sure.
I can hear you, Christine. I'll have to wait to hear this next speaker.
Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Professor Hopkins, for this magisterial new book. And as Ademide already said, I think it's a book that is very enlivening and such an addition to our understanding of 19th century Lagos history, but also a resource in a way, right? She talked about it as kind of containing lost archives itself. So I really appreciate the work for that reason. And my interest in it, I come at it through a new interest in 19th century Lagos, an interest in family history, and also an interest in biography and the importance of biography in our writing of Africa, and the way African history has been written in the West, which for a long time kind of anonymized the actors. There were so many points, as has already been stated. This is a big book, okay, so almost 600 pages, and thankfully, very engagingly written, because I had to read it on a screen, which is not my thing, because I'm not Gen Z. So, a bit of a challenge. And so there are various, so I read it in many different stages. And at different stages, I would have a question of the book. So at one point, I had a question about, what is meant by trader in this book. It starts out with a long discussion about property, and property maybe as the basis of wealth generation, but also maybe property as something different from, or property management as something different from trading or business. And so I had a question about, what is the thinking about the relationship of this between the concept of the merchant and the property owner? Are these the same kind of categories, of analytical categories? But then later on in the book, there becomes a kind of a merging of thinking about the interactivity between property ownership, property management, and prospects within trading within the mercantile space, and especially within kind of transoceanic trading. So between Lagos, the coast, and really with Europe and Britain in particular. And I saw this, this merging starts to happen around the biography of Isaac Williams. And then by the end, we really move into property as property ownership, property management, property business as a kind of solid focus of thinking about, this merchant class and what mercantilism in Lagos evolved into. So I was like, oh, wow, you know, I had a question, he answered it. I had the question that Ademide raised earlier, which is the question of, this is so interesting, you know, the archives for historians so often like dictate the narrative we're able to tell. And that is a disciplinary convention and as it should be, but it's also a disciplinary limitation. So if you know that the category of merchant or trader or business person encompasses a broader swath of the society, then the archive is able to speak to, record, or have an interest in, then how as a historian do you move beyond what the archive allows you? And some of the limitations of the archive are that it does have a kind of a androcentric focus. So it's very interested in male actors. The archive is also very interested in the coast. So when we think about Lagos, we're really talking about kind of coastal merchants, coastal men. And then the archive is also very interested in 19th century archive is very interested in Christians. So if you are not Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you are just a traditionalist or whatever, the archive is not really going to capture that dimension of social life as clearly. And Professor Hopkins acknowledges this and also works very creatively, I think, to at least draw out some names that can help us to imagine beyond what the archive allows us to know. So, you know, he draws out the names of, some names of some people I hadn't heard of, Hamani Alake, Celia, Jawandu, I think, Ureti, and various other women. You know, there are some names that we have heard when we talk about religious difference. Of course, the Shitabe name which is a transgenerational business family, right? Starting from Sierra Leone. So the Shitabe family, the Balogun, there are some interventions that he tries to make to deal with this problem of the archive that is, you know, focused on the coastal Christian man, to help us imagine what is happening with Muslims, what is happening with women, what is happening inland beyond the coast, and how might those histories be related to Lagos as well. The book starts out very much thinking about trade as ocean facing. And so that raised another question for me. And this ocean facing trade is one in which, you know, these coastal merchants have to deal with European institutions, whether these are governing institutions like the colonial state, financial institutions, the banks, the combines that get formed, etc. And and you know, Manchester companies that they're reliant on for their import-export trade, etc. And this reliance, this brings us to, you know, the question of dependence, and how does the kind of economic system that is built right around the coast kind of tend towards promoting a relationship of dependency, like economic dependency on what is happening in Europe for these coastal merchants? How does that affect their fortunes, the waxing and waning that Ademide talked about? And, you know, by chapter 6, finally, Professor Hopkins asked the question, which is the question, you know, did that relationship with Europe underdevelop these African merchants? Like, what is the impact of that dependency, that interdependency with European capital, with European governments, with European merchants? What was the impact of that on African mercantile fortunes? And I kept looking for an answer to that question, and I would like you to maybe come back to it, because I think there was a bit of I came away with a sense of ambivalence or reticence to fully, you know, deal with that. Because because we get a number of biographies, I think, that allow us to think about these merchants as individuals, right? That kind of thank you, Kristen, that disaggregate the category of African in the Africa that is developed or undeveloped, and turns them into stories of individuals within a market, a new kind of globalizing market system. Some individuals are good businessmen, some are not. Some get access to capital, some are not. Some fall sick, some don't, you know, some have helpers and some different strategies. So at the end of the day, when we understand the biographies of all of these numerous merchants, does that disallow us from talking about a relationship between quote unquote Africa and quote unquote Europe? You know, what does kind of the disentangling, the disaggregating of the Africa category in this global economic relationship by the foregrounding of individual narratives, what does it allow? What does it disallow?
We seem to be returning.
Okay. So can I get my time? I reclaim my time.
You get 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That's where you were, honestly. 30 seconds is what, honestly, where you were.
All right. So there's a lot of family in this book, right? So family history sources for writing about what became family businesses. And I was interested to know about how kind of like transnational family strategies can be a way to, whether you think that they were a way to kind of insulate against the vulnerabilities that African merchants faced in the global economy. So having businesses that were connected through family members to different countries, to different economies, between Sierra Leone and Lagos, to Badagry, but then sending children to Europe, to Brazil, etc. How do you think that transnational family formation played a role in the business strategies of the merchants that you look at? Can I just ask one more question?
No, Bossy, I'm sorry, because we are losing time as we need to move on. That was a wonderful.
Thank you.
That was a wonderful concluding question. Thank you so much. Vivian, take it away.
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so I just want to say thank you so much. I wish I was there in person. I plan to be next year. Lega Studies Association is always my favorite conference. So also apologize. I just had some big dental work, so I feel like I can barely speak, but so bear with me. Okay, the book features an array of empirical cases, as has been said, detailed narratives of life stories. They provide an important texture to the composition of Lagos's commercial landscape and its transformations after the formal abolition of the transatlantic slave trade. So through the figure of the entrepreneur, the book posits that a range of Black African entrepreneurs played key roles in shaping the colonial export and import economy. This book, as others have said, is an incredible read. I also had to read it as a PDF right now, so I envy all of you who will be able to read it in its paper version. But one of the interesting discussions for me that came out of it was that Hopkins explicitly critiques Western economic theory and how its concepts have been traditionally seen as not fitting or ill-fitting to African economic history by popular and academic analysis. Oftentimes, African contexts can be talked about as exceptional or not rational. And instead, Hopkins mobilizes the figure of the entrepreneur to show technical innovations and commercial successes of the set of people he follows, which are largely Saro business people, who are estimated to be almost 3/4 of Lagos's elite in the late 1800s, and how these key actors were important in the development of capitalism in the colonies. And so this group of people were particularly positioned and traveled alongside and through the British Empire in the wake of the slave trade, the formal end of the slave trade, and proved to be advantageous as commercial and political intermediaries. Yet this intermediary position was not a given, it's not a foretold. And so Hopkins shows it through all of these life stories that these business people actively created new kinds of distributive networks and markets. So because capitalism features so strongly as an analytic, I was also thinking, one of the rich details that comes out in all of these life stories, connections that are being drawn, is that we see on the export side that this is kind of the same time period that even Marx, for example, is writing and developing critiques of capitalism in Manchester factories. And the book shows how we see imperial and colonial territories are already drawn into these extensive capitalist networks through cash crop exports such as palm oil and imports such as manufactured cotton from Manchester itself. So Lagos we see is tightly interlinked with English cities, and we know this through a range of historical works, including this books such as Manchester and Liverpool, through also not just the commodities, but its actual business people who attempt to influence commerce in Lagos. And so it just was interesting. It made me wonder what analysis, for example, of Marx's books, Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3 would look like if analysis was expanded out from Manchester towards its material flows to empire in Nigeria. Between 1906 and 10, we see that Britain and Germany received an average of 96% of Lagos's exports and supplied 87% of its imports. So the book notes that, quote, if colonies in Africa and Asia had served as a refuge for Britain's stable manufacturers during the second half of the 19th century, there are indications that by 1914, these markets could no longer be preserved under conditions of free trade. So interestingly, the British consolidate dominant power over the export sector only after World War I, with the withdrawal of German companies. And so we see how slogans of free trade actually serve to mask a range of political forces at play, particularly imperial ones. So of particular interest to me as an economic anthropologist was how these big entrepreneurs actually created massive distribution systems which had an array of middlemen, or were called barracooners, brokers, a whole range of names. I'm working through my own project on the politics of profit and trains of exchange in Nigeria's contemporary importation from now the global south. And the prevalence and power of intermediaries in transnational commodity chains is very striking. So the book, as has been said, follows the biographies, mostly of big men, but it continually shows that intermediaries were not simply parasitic or disposable, but instead key in creating an import consumer market, even in times of export downturns. Took a course, not taught, but took a course on Marx's book Grundrisse, which argues that capitalist value is not simply created in an industrial factory, but also realized, or it's made real. Utilization processes through markets are the central to creating capitalist commodity chains. So this book, I think, actually illustrates this quite nicely in terms of looking at how one important creation of business people in Lagos was constant economic diversification of business activities, whether this is diversification of commodity imports, which were tailored to different African consumer demands, or the diversification of endeavors in production and agricultural business. So another quote to illustrate this was, produce was accumulated in successive stages of increasing bulk. Imports were broken down in the same way until they reached petty traders in the streets of Lagos and villages of the hinterland. The system was composed of many moving parts and vulnerable to internal strains and external political events. Yet trading networks proved their flexibility and resilience. They survived crises that occurred in the 19th century, wrenching changes brought by colonial rule, and the criticism directed at them by colonial officials and expatriate firms, who were inclined to think that they burdened an otherwise economic commercial system. And so the book shows that Western expatriate firms actually fail to bypass intermediaries, which frustrates them tremendously. So again, kind of coming back to racial capitalism, especially the contemporary debates around that, which are hinted at in the book in the beginning and end. Historians of racial capitalism of the Atlantic world have shown us how racial formation, particularly in relation to enslaved and free labor, were central to the emergence of global capitalism. And I think this book expands this to think about how race and capitalist formation also emerges through the commercial sector and shifting commercial conditions. So there's other historians who've worked on this, particularly in the Asian and Indian Ocean context. And I think that this book contributes to that in many ways by also drawing in together how these institutions of capitalism were formed, including not just trade, but this also included the development of property rights in a particular way, wage labor, and making new markets for capital. So there's portions that show how land was transformed into a commodity, which made new kinds of circuits and scales of credit. And this, of course, has huge impact. Thank you, Kristen, I see that. All right, I wanted to just mention 3 things. Just race appears several times in the book. One interesting point is about how racism becomes increasingly codified and institutionalized after a generation of prominent Saudi businessmen and politicians come into power, and then kind of argues that actually this hardening of explicit racism also leads to, in some ways, colonialism's agitations and undoing, in terms of then making people identify and push for nativist and later nationalist action. And my 2 quick questions are just about military actions. We see a very vivid bombing of Lagos, an invasion. And I was just wondering how this relates to other military actions in the colonies, such as the Benin expedition and massacre in 1897, and other kinds of moments of political force in Nigeria and other British colonies. So just kind of in relation to the region and other colonies. And then a minor question about the role of profiteering legislation. I know during after World War I that becomes a big issue, and I know later a lot of African newspaper columnists complain about profiteering legislation actually is disproportionately affecting African business people and leading to the consolidation of these big companies. Okay, and last, I just want to emphasize that this is a very pleasurable read, and there's a lot of enticing details and footnotes. So I encourage you all, as you're reading, to carefully look at those. There's one footnote that includes the fact that the descendant of one of these business people had the documents destroyed after her death. You know, those kinds of things. It leads to a lot of open question marks that I will just leave here. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Vivian. Monsuru, will you please begin?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be on this panel today to discuss capitalism in the colonies, African merchants in Lagos, 1851 to 1931. I would say that it's an excellent addition to the existing body of knowledge on the economic history of Lagos. Yes, scholarly studies on African economic history are substantial, but much has not been done on individual merchants in Lagos within the context of successes and failures in an environment that offered opportunities and limitations. This is what this new book from Professor Anthony Hopkins Research Library has to offer. In addition, the uniqueness of this book lies in the fact that Anthony Hopkins' methodology bestrides political economy, statistics, history, sociology, and ethnography to illuminate on the neglected aspects of fortunes and trajectories of African merchants in the colony of Lagos between 1851 and 1931. His tool of analysis benefited from the lavish use of myriad of sources, including cemeteries and obituaries, where information were obtained to narrate family histories synonymous with wealth, indebtedness, successes, and failures. These I find to be quite educative and informative as a researcher. I mean, because what it then means is that we must have nose for, for information. We must have that creative mind to identify both animate and inanimate things to get information on our subject of research. The author situates the book in 3 classified external shocks, yes, that altered relationships among the components of the economic environment. By engaging colonial policy, the expatriate firms, African businesses, and international trade to explain the emergence, types, and rise and fall of African merchants during the period of study. Hopkins posits that the bombardment of Lagos in 1851 and the introduction of legitimate trade in palm oil and palm kernels laid the foundation for the emergence of African merchants, especially among the Saro, who were quick to promote civilization and commerce. The Bible and the plow. In its classification of merchants in Lagos, the Saro occupies the #1 position, followed by the indigenous Lagosians and few Brazilian expatriates. In fact, Saro merchants led the revolutionary changes of laying the foundations of the economy that characterized the greater part of the colonial period. And so Hopkins made us to understand that the period of bombardment and annexation of Lagos ushered in the policy of commoditization of land in Lagos, wherein crown grants were used as means of land dispossession and possession in Lagos. I come again. Land dispossession and possession in Lagos. Dispossession on the part of the colonial authorities and possession on the part of the African merchants who emerged and saw opportunities in investment in landed property. This was also complemented with the introduction of wage labor, which both facilitated granting of credits and debit payments to solidify the economy of Lagos. The economic landscape, according to Hopkins, was dotted with import and export trade, such that the mercantile community was dominated by Europeans, Saro merchants, and indigenous Lagosians, who availed themselves the opportunities this period had to offer. Few examples of individuals who emerged during the first shock would include, but not limited to, Oshodi Tapa and Mohammed Shita. Oshodi Tapa was a slave trader, and a war chief who converted to legitimate commerce and became the main agent of an European firm. While Mohammed Shita, later known as Shita Bey, a repatriated Saro, but a Lagosian, rose to become the most prominent and wealthiest Muslim in Lagos by trading in European goods and landed property via obtaining numerous crown grants between 1850s and 1880s. The book also traces to the colonial period the importance of investment in property and rental incomes as a source of generational wealth transferable at death. In fact, this is a very excellent one by Professor Hopkins, because what he has done is to bring to the fore, the connection between what obtains in the contemporary period now, as far as investment is concerned in the city of Lagos, and what obtained in the past, by making us realize that, investment in property, as we see it today in the contemporary period, actually started in the colonial period, wherein some African merchants delved into that and they made wealth for their generation yet unborn. He cited the examples of individuals who made wealth from property and transferred to their next generation. Jacob Samuel Lay, among others, is a vivid example. You need to read the book for more details. The book is carefully written to capture the impact of the three shocks on the merchants of the time. There are fascinating and informative stories of rise and fall of the African merchants who engaged in all forms of businesses, from sole proprietorship, partnership, merger and acquisition, and investment. In fact, one interesting story captured in this book is that of Daniel Conrad Taiwo, an illiterate former slave who became one of the greatest merchants and political influencers of the period. His relationship with James Davis, who earned the appellation the King of the Merchant Princes, due to his excellence and dexterity in trading, has been described as that of reciprocity, connection, and social capital. Summarily put, what Professor Hopkins has done here is to let us see the importance of connection, political influence in businesses, and the importance of social capital in making wealth. A I mean, a read through the book will give us comprehensive details about this. The book also traces the second shock of 1892, the second shock to 1892, when the British government decided to enlarge the colony at that time, and when it was still confined to the island of Lagos and a narrow strip on the mainland side of the lagoon. It discusses the changing business environments in terms of deployment of social and economic infrastructure of trade, and how this influenced the performance of African merchants, such as Samuel Paz, who built the Elephant House, Josiah Doherty, who built the Doherty House, and Peter A.W. Thomas, who built the... Can you hear me?
Yes, continue.
Okay, in fact, despite the expansion of the business district to the suburbs, it did not diminish the attraction of the island, and the focus remained the marina and the broad streets. The third shock emerged following the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. The war obviously disrupted international commerce and presented fresh challenges to African merchants. It discusses the commercial rivalries between the warring European countries, especially between Germany and Britain. The expulsion of the German firms was a particularly serious setback for merchants who had benefited from trading with the Germans. Of course, they became collateral collateral damage, a kind of collateral damage. Few examples surface of such merchants who had benefited in trading with Germany, but eventually became affected. People like Josiah Doherty and Ali Balogun were badly affected with the new British policy on Germany during the First World War. Another fascinating story is the transition of Peter Thomas from a civil servant to a business mogul. It is also a very good story to read. I will conclude by saying that, well, the book can be recommended for all those that are interested. It is recommended, rather, for all those that are interested in the history of Lagos, and that the LSA conference is an appropriate platform to have this book discussed. And lastly, I want to call the attention of Hopkins to page 67, where Oluwole was mistakenly rendered as Oluwale Street, page 67 of the book. Thank you for giving me the privilege to be part of the panel.
Thank you so much. Deji, will you begin, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, I will have to abandon the script. I'm very serious about that because I took time to read the book, not just because it's relevant, but because of my commitment or my personal association with Professor Hopkins, whose book I encountered as an undergraduate in 1979. And that course was taught by his student, Professor Owen Joku. And my PhD was based almost exactly on Hopkins' thesis because I focused on the post-1914 period, which he didn't cover. So I'm paying him. You can't hear me?
I'm losing. I think I don't know where the microphone is for Deji, but
it is here.
He's turning his head too much. If there's a microphone in front of him, I don't know. If he could speak into it directly, because I'm losing him from time to time. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Good. So let me just go straight to my script. As I said, I'm taking off half of the script, and I will read so that I will keep within the 8-minute period that I have. Thank you. This is a notable volume on African business history, located in the social and political economic milieu. It studies the subfields of economic, social, urban, and business history. It covers a wide range of business activities such as trade, real estate, credit and banking, agriculture, and transport. It focuses on the central role of capital, based essentially on land and property. According to Hopkins on page 96, quote, "No commercial investment will match the value of a crown grant secured in the 1860s," unquote. money lending was conducted with real estate as collateral. In this book, you're also going to find, I'm going to mention some of the things you find there which were of interest to me. Risk, trust, and betrayal. Entrepreneurs as risk takers and captains of expeditions as in the original formulation of the word enterprise. You are going to find accumulation and its dissipation through conspicuous consumption. On page 487, Hopkins mentioned the act of turning, quote, success to excess, unquote. There were wrong investment decisions, litigation, but there was also the exceptionalism of Ali Balogun and Josiah Doherty, who survived all vicissitudes. You find that on page 338. There was the role of networks, social networks, religious networks, and all that. There was also class solidarity. And I want to ask Professor Hopkins at this point, why did Taiwo Olowo fail to bail out his friend, JPL Davis? There was also the role of state actors. You can compare John Glover and John Hope Hennessy in the mid-19th century. You can also mention the cases of Gilbert Carter and Alfred Moloney. In this book, you also find the recurring cycles of boom and bust. In other words, a climate of uncertainty. According to Hopkins, greatness was achieved by investment rather than by investment, and force was often deployed. In this book, you're going to find accounts of succession and diversification. And we have instances of Davis, Coker, Brahma Igbo, Pierce, Adishigbe, Thomas, etc., as Schumpeterian innovators. That was my conclusion on page 21. But on page 489, Hopkins said that the Africans introduced some elements of capitalism. Let me quote him now: freehold property rights, wage labor, and market for capital. But at the same time, he said, Thomas, that is P.J.C. Thomas, I'm quoting him now, fell short of being Schumpeter's ideal heroic innovator. I have a question that I'll pose at the end of my presentation. Then, of course, we have some exceptionalisms. For example, George and Son survived over 3 generations, and that firm petered out only in the 1940s. I'm going to ask another question regarding that shortly. In this book, you're going to find the adjudicatory role of the courts, which saved many businesses and ruined others. For example, D.C. Taiwo Olowo had recourse to the law court to recover debt. You can see that on page 119. But then much of the travails of JPL Davis came through the law courts when he was taken through the courts for bankruptcy. But it's also interesting that JPL Davis saved himself by playing smart. In other words, using property jointly owned as collateral, because at that time you couldn't forfeit property owned jointly by more than the person that took the credit. One untold story in this book, which you need to know about, is that it was boom time for lawyers. It was one profession that did not suffer bankruptcy. It even fed fat on it. And I asked the question, are lawyers vultures? Do they feed on carrion? And one interesting thing that Professor Hopkins mentioned on page 382 is that merchants could even sue one another and still remain friends, which is not what obtains today. And then, of course, in the book, finally, you are going to see personality differences and clashes based on political affiliations. And there were press wars. I will call your attention to pages 430 to 431 and see how Sakito Iyajasa put down G.K. Coker. It's something that you'll find striking. I want to pose these questions now. Was the terminal date of 1931 one of convenience or something, or just because of alliteration? Since the Great Depression did not end in 1931, and the book in many instances went beyond 1931, why 1931? Was not the Great Depression of 1929-33 a fourth shock, meriting a distinct treatment? Why did you stop in 1931? Why didn't you take on it up to 1933? And if you're talking of shocks, what about the aftershocks? Because that also happens during earthquakes. I'm still talking of shocks. Are you suggesting that those shocks being external robbed Africans of their agency? Because right now we are talking of external factors constraining. Another question, can we generalize from these business biographies about the role of the family in the family business? Was polygamy helpful or harmful? Was marriage in itself always an asset? I want to compare, and you did it in your book. Da Rocha never married. Doherty had several wives. And we had several turbulent monogamous marriages. We had cases of divorce, widowhood, and concubinage. What was the role of matrimony or the lack of it in these discussions? Another question, what then did it mean to be successful? Because on page 394, you raised that issue about somebody not being successful, somebody being successful. I have 2 minutes, I'll finish in 2 minutes. So, with the exception of Taiwo Olowo, Ali Balogun, and Joseph Doherty, who weathered all storms, peers who rose and fell, Candido Da Rocha that played safe, who would you regard as the ideal successful merchant, and why? Of what significance was the physical and fiscal infrastructure of business, steamshipping, railway and port development, currency transition, commercial banking in themselves within the overarching shocks that we discussed? This one is an observation, it's not a question. It appears to me that the Saro were disproportionately represented relative to their share of the population. And then, of course, the etymology of Olowo. I think that I saw Habib standing here. My hunch is that Olowo might mean a place literally where the owner of the money takes his money back. So it refers to money lending specifically. In my opinion, I may be wrong, and not just to commerce as such. I have 1 minute, and I think I want to just take that 1 minute to make a presentation about this book. This book is unique in the sense that this is a book that took 60 years to execute. It grew out of just the appendix in the thesis. Until this book was published, we all relied on that appendix in that thesis and the Red Book of West Africa. If you want to supersede all those two sources, want to transcend them, you need to get a copy of Hopkins's, what is it now? Capitalism in the Colonies, African Merchants in Lagos. I also want to say that by way of self-promotion, I was happy to see that I was very well cited in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Deji. Professor Hopkins, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I must thank Sahid and his team for organizing this session, Kristin for chairing it, and all the contributors for wading through my long book. But you know, all things are relative. You should be happy that you weren't asked to a round table on my previous book, American Empire, which was nearly 1,000 pages. So you are really very fortunate indeed. Yes, and as I just mentioned, since Deji referred happily to the number of references in the bibliography to his own work, you know, Deji, we're both experienced scholars. There's no way I was going to leave you out of this book. Okay. I've been trying to take effective notes on everything that has been said. Oh, I must say that I'm missing a few of these because of the acoustic at crucial points. So I apologize. It will be impossible for me to cover everything. I will say a few general things to begin with, which bear upon some of the comments made. I mean, first of all, as Deji pointed out, this is in many ways a very old book in its conception. And my preface explains this and how it came to be that it didn't finish up, in my estimation, as being a publishable dissertation. The subject moved on faster than I could keep up with it. Then this problem of all of the help I'd received in Lagos and the special documentation I had managed to gather stayed with me, and it became a burden on my back. And I felt that I simply had to do everything I could to make the documentation and what came in my book to be a coherent story, because I owed it to everyone who'd helped me primarily. Now, in the passage of that large number of decades, of course, things have changed considerably. And one of the things that's happened until recently is that economic history, which was in vogue in the 1960s and 70s, went out of fashion. I won't go into the reasons for this, you know them well enough. But then after the turn of the century, the so-called new economic history began to cut through many issues that we either hadn't thought about or didn't know how to manage and research. The problem, it's not a problem, but the new history, the new economic history is very quantitative and has done brilliantly, but it's not the totality of economic history. And entrepreneurship, what I've tried to do in the book is to resurrect entrepreneurship as being a key issue in economic history and linking it to problems of economic development. And that's one thing that this audience and others may feel is worth pursuing or not. But why I was finally set down to write this book was the realization that it hadn't been done. I was amazed to find that no coherent study of the kind I've done, with all its limitations, had been executed in the course of 60 years. So that was another reason why I felt this had to be done, especially to present some of the documentation that questioners have referred to, notably that of Daniel Taiwo, which is quite extraordinary, and a revelation about his extensive family, as it was mentioned in question, family, a diaspora of Taiwos, if you like, going up the Niger and even out to Bahia and certainly along the West Coast. And then his connections to government. This is taking the lid off and exposing the reality of what was going on in Lagos beneath the official papers. Two questioners at the opening correctly drew attention to omissions in the book. And the two I was particularly conscious of were women, which has been mentioned, and I think in a way, forgive me, more important, that of Muslims. I say more important because there were very important Muslim merchants who were on a par, even exceeded the Saro in the scale of their business. With somebody mentioned correctly, Mashitabe, and I tried to do something with a very famous 20th century merchant, Ali Balogun. But in both cases, I couldn't find any documentation. And as I say in the book, I couldn't find any surviving documentation for any of the Muslim merchants I studied. there are reasons for that, apart from my own failures as a researcher. Women, well, I made a big effort, believe it or not, ladies, I made a big effort to correct what remains not to be an omission, but a very limited treatment. Again, the problem is not a lack of will or intention. The problem is a lack of documentation. So on both those fronts, Muslims and women, I would urge those of you who have a career in front of you, I would urge you to consider this historically as something worth prospecting in a way that I failed to do. Yes, I would just mention at this point two important considerations, one of which has not been referred to in the questions, the contributions by those assessing my book. And that's not a criticism, you can't get in everything. But from my researcher's point of view, the discovery of the cocoa farming industry at Ijon, Deji and I went to visit Ijon when I was last in Lagos in December. And then, of course, the complementary development of Agege. And those were two moments of discovery involving field work and a whole set of different archival resources. That's one thing. The second thing is escaping me for the moment. Williams family, forgive me. Right. Now, memo to old scholars, never say you're going to make 2 points unless you could remember the second one. Yes, it's come back to me. This is what happens. You think you've got dementia, and fortunately it comes back. It has been spoken about by several questioners, and I'm glad because it's a key issue. And that is basically what happened to these entrepreneurs. Were they pushed out, or did they survive, and in what ways and for how long? Now, that is a central theme of the book. And one of the surprising findings for me was that the survival rate, even through the early colonial period, was much better than is commonly thought, and much better than I had anticipated it would be when I wrote my PhD, which, like all PhDs, was an incomplete piece of work. And I expected that what I argued then, or at least tentatively put forward, that these great merchants of the golden age were simply lost and not replaced, I expected that that would be continued through the period and so on. Well, as you'll see from the book, I try carefully to assess their role in the import and export trades, but then, of course, I go on to discover for myself, because I had no idea about this, the diversification, not only the cocoa farms I've mentioned, but also the diversification within Lagos that is detailed in the book. Now, why do I stop in 1931? There are several sophisticated answers to this question that I could try to calm the audience with. But the basic answer, I think, is exhaustion. Now, those of you who've not written big books yet may laugh at that. But believe me, there comes a point where you feel you cannot do any more. And every book, wherever you stop, whatever book you write, you can never do it. Some people will say, well, you know, you started at this point, but of course there are anticipations, antecedents going back 2 centuries, and you say yes. And others will say, well, you know, you stopped here, it's not very satisfactory, why didn't you go on, and so on. Now, books can only do so much, and authors also get exhausted. A slightly more reasonable defense of 1931. Of course, as you will see, it makes a nice round number with 1851, but it wasn't as superficial as all that in my intention, because 2931 were really the beginning of the world slump, and 1931, the world financial crisis. And that seemed to me to be a good point of halting, because that was the moment when we're in the middle of the phase in which every merchant, including the newly formed United African Company, every merchant were under pressure and going out of business. The second reason is that my own detailed research, my own merchants I studied, these guys were dying out or else in retirement. So I didn't have the material to continue the story with the depth that I thought it needed. So the author will always say, if he gets experience, that this you then hand over to members of the audience and others and say, look, as I said in the book towards the end, this next period, the interwar period down to decolonization, that's the period that really has so much potential and needs researching. Last point, and I'm so sorry that I have not answered everything. I will just look a second to see if I can do something else. And that is that, as I said at the outset, the study of entrepreneurship, which used to be such a dominant theme in Western history and began to have a basis for it in the case of West Africa in the 60s and 70s, needs to be resurrected. And I hope that the book will have said enough to stimulate or interest some of you to following that through. Now, I have just a couple of minutes in hand. I'll look to see if there's anything huge that I have a note of that polygamy. Yeah, the question of marriage and merchants. Most of the Saro merchants were monogamous. You'll see, and I thought I should make a bit more of this, but I didn't get round to doing it. You will see that the wives of these merchants did play a part, sometimes regularly in the shops or stores, and especially when the merchant was away or ill, which happens in several cases. So this was a departure from them of the Victorian ideal when they were supposed to be decorative and not much else. But again, I think there's a lot more work in that. And finally, what amazed me was to find that so little had been done by historical researchers to really go through the Supreme Court records of 1867 onwards. Those are the records which disastrously, scandalously were destroyed a couple of years ago. Now, we don't know the extent of the destruction, but the word is that most of the 19th century material is gone. Now, that is irreparable. I believe I'm correct in saying that only Christine and I have made extensive use of it, and speaking for myself, I'm conscious that there was a whole lot of stuff that I didn't get round to. And then the other source, which is absolutely vital, as you'll see from my footnotes, for land transaction, of course, is the Lands Office records. Now, I haven't been back there recently, but those were very well organized. As far as I know, they haven't been ransacked or destroyed, and they're just sitting there. And the fact that these sources, one of them could not be reconstructed, and the other had not been fully explored, was another incentive, making sure I wrote and finally finished this book. If you haven't seen it, that's it. The on the cover is of Ebute Ero Market in 1920. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Hopkins. According to my watch, we do have 5 minutes. Is there a question from the audience? If so, I can see hands. If you raise your hand high and come forward and speak in the microphone, or if you enter a question in a chat if you're on Zoom. And those of you who are in Lagos, if there's someone in the audience, invite them forward to speak into the microphone.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Kristen. My name is Lawan. Hi, my name is Lawan Adams. My question is, firstly, when will the book be available for purchase and where? Will it be available in Lagos?
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm glad that there's interest here. I have just a few copies, which are the advanced copies. It's a little complicated. The book is published officially in the United States on the 17th of July, but availability in UK, and I presume Nigeria, is in early September. This is simply because after much discussion, it was decided to produce the book in the States and not in the United Kingdom. Don't ask. So the stocks are in the United States, and the difference is simply the time taken to transmit them to UK.
Okay, and if I can just, the reason why I asked is my primary focus is in tourism, and it's how we extract from such wealth of information what we can use to educate Nigerians, you know, that and others. And Aduke and I am sitting next to my partner here, Aduke, and we're already working out how I will buy the book, she will read it and compress it for me to extract and push into the tourism business. So I have how I noticed there's a part of the history which pertains to commerce that I've not heard anybody talk about, and that's the impact of the Yoruba Wars and the players in the Yoruba Wars and how they influenced Governor Carter to before he went to war with the Jebu. How important, I don't know if that is captured at all, and I feel that is quite important because of trade today and how that plays out. Like I said, we're trying to pass on it's not just about the history, it's about how it impacts on our present and possibly on our future, and how we can use that. So I'd like to know if any consideration was put into that as well.
And just before you answer,
I'm so sorry, that became rather elongated and I failed to grasp the key point. If you can put it in one sentence, I will do my very best.
What's the importance of the Yoruba Wars and how the merchants, especially the Saro merchants that were of different nationalities, whether they were Egbas, whether they were...
Okay. Wonderful point. Thank you so much. Well, with the 5 seconds I've got, I think that I can only refer you to my book, which is not the final word on the subject, but it does cite the key authorities on this issue, from Toyin Falola to Robin Law. They're the authorities. I make my own mind up about them, but that would be the quickest way I can suggest to you that you will get the information from my source. There are others which cite the same sources too. But thank you very much. That was most lucid.
Professor Hopkins, my name is Aduke Gomez. I'd like to say thank you for writing about my great-grandfather. And it's amazing to be in the room with also yourself and Professor Mann, who is also writing about my Gomez ancestor as well. So it's amazing. Thank you very much.
Can I just ask there? Sorry, I didn't get the name. Who was your great-grandfather?
J.H. Doherty.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yes,
very big
yes.
help indeed. Well,
And his daughter married a descendant of Francisco Gomez.
okay. Well, thank you. I know we're short of time, but I have to say that, because I haven't said this before, but one of the delights for me is when somebody like you says something about that. But the fear that I have is getting some of these intricate family relations wrong. And your mind goes back to the hours you've spent studying your notes from the law court records about somebody saying, he was my uncle, and another member of the family said, no way he was an uncle, he was a this or that. And you're sitting there thinking, how do I get that right? Because from that decision, other dynastic consequences follow. So believe me, I shall tremble to get those letters saying, Professor Hopkins, you spent all this time and you still haven't understood my family. But of course, in the book, which you will not have seen yet, you will find a rather fine photograph of J.H. Doherty. And I did know Adebayo Doherty very well indeed. We were friends, actually. And the end of the section on Doherty refers to Adebayo Doherty's special Rolls Royce, which used to go from Lagos in the 60s and 70s. I think you'll find that section quite engaging. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Friends, I hate to say it, but I think we're out of time. I want to thank Professor Hopkins for writing this book. I want to thank all the panelists for their insightful commentary and for the questions they've asked. I thank those of you in the audience for being with us today. I wish I could be in Lagos. I wish we had twice as long and we could all sit around a table together and interact face to face. That said, I commend the Lagos Studies Association for the wonderful work it does to bring people around the world who are interested in the history of not just Lagos and Nigeria, but of Africa together virtually so that we can interact. And I'm grateful to Zoom for making it all possible. Thanks so much to all of you for a wonderful session.
Thank you.
All.
Thank you.
All.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
See you, Christian.
Pleasure.
You must be really tired, so thank you.
No. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I get up early anyway.
Yes, a hard copy of the book. Really, I would say the middle of July.
I look forward to that. I'm so excited. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I think but I will ask them and make sure. I don't know what the plans are.
Thank you so much. I'll be back in Atlanta in July, so I look forward to that.
Otherwise, the only reason I don't want to send you a copy, though I'll have to, I don't want to lost you. And
I know.
Yeah.
I know. But we'll communicate it about. I'll email you.
It's much easier when it's Princeton send it when you guys
If Princeton, yes, if Princeton will do it, it's much more certain. That's right. Well done.
Stay well, Christine. Bye.
Bye. Duque, I see you. Duque. All right, bye.
Bye.
Hi, Duque. Hi. So good to see you.
Talk to you soon.
Yes, I'll talk to you soon.
Let's take a photo.